Welcome to this comprehensive explainer. Today, we're initiating a rigorous, entirely objective forensic audit of the historical and textual foundations of the Quranic text. We are stepping into a university-level academic analysis, and we're going to systematically evaluate 10 highly dense, empirically driven scholarly arguments. These arguments, advanced by textual critics, historians, and apologists over the years, scrutinize the internal logic, the physical manuscript record, and the historical claims of the Quran. Our objective here is to impartially examine the data, looking solely at the evidence, and asking the hard questions about structural integrity. It's a lot of ground to cover, but it's absolutely crucial for understanding the historical reality of this text. Okay, let's dive right in. To structure our investigation today, we're going to divide this explainer into 4 distinct phases. We'll start with internal logic and epistemology, then move into historical and physical evidence. After that, we'll look at source syncretism and errors, and finally, textual divergence and our conclusion.
So let's kick things off with Phase 1, internal logic and epistemology. Our forensic audit begins with item number 1 on our list, the Islamic Dilemma, which is also known as the verification paradox. Now, this is a cornerstone analytical framework for scholars and researchers like Sam Shamoun and God Logic Apologetics. According to these analysts, the Quran explicitly commands Muslims and the people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews, to consult the Torah and the Gospel as guidance and light to verify the Quran's message. You can find this in places like Surah 547 and 1094. But here is where a massive logical tension arises when we apply basic historical context. We have the manuscript evidence. We know exactly what the 7th century biblical texts said at the time this command was given. They are identical in doctrine to our modern editions. And those texts unequivocally affirm the historical crucifixion of Jesus and his divine sonship. Yet the Quran, in Surah 457, explicitly denies those exact claims. According to scholars, this creates a fatal logical trap. Think about it. If the 7th century Bible is an authoritative true text, well then the Quran is false, because it fundamentally contradicts the Bible's core historical doctrines. Conversely, if the 7th century Bible is a corrupt text, then the Quran is still false because it explicitly commands its followers to appeal to a corrupt standard for truth and verification. You see the problem? Both avenues logically invalidate the premise of the text's own internal claims.
And that brings us directly to item 4, tahrif. This is the Islamic theological defense asserting the universal corruption and alteration of the Christian and Jewish scriptures over time. It's essentially the necessary theological shield used to explain away the massive contradictions we just talked about. But from a purely historical and logistical perspective, critics argue this presents a complete impossibility. To alter the core theological message of the Christian scriptures globally prior to the 7th century would have required a synchronized, massive conspiracy. Someone or some group would have had to locate, physically confiscate, and uniformly modify tens of thousands of handwritten manuscripts distributed across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Let's put that into perspective for a second. In modern terms, it would be literally like trying to simultaneously hack thousands of completely disconnected offline computers scattered across the globe, running on multiple different operating systems and changing their core code without leaving a single digital footprint. They would have had to do this simultaneously across languages like Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, without leaving a single trace of this massive global alteration behind in the historical record. It's just not feasible. And the physical data illustrates precisely why scholars view this as a logistical impossibility. We actually possess extant, pre-Islamic manuscripts. We're talking about Papyrus 52 from the 2nd century, Papyrus 66 from around 200 CE, and the massive complete Bibles like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century. According to textual scholars, these physical manuscripts demonstrate macrostructural stability and doctrinal consistency centuries before Muhammad was even born. Textual scholars argue that these physical manuscripts expose the fallacy of tahrif because they prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that no global corruption event ever occurred. The physical timeline shows an unbroken continuity of the exact specific doctrines that the Quran later rejects.
Which leads us seamlessly into item 5, the circular burden of proof. In any forensic debate, or really any historical analysis, the burden of proof falls strictly upon the party asserting that a historical alteration has occurred. If you claim a document was changed, you have to prove it. Because Islamic tradition cannot provide a textual baseline, meaning an authentic, physical, pre-corruption manuscript of the Bible that actually aligns with Quranic claims, the doctrine of tahrif functions as an unfalsifiable hypothesis. Critics point out that the logic here is entirely circular. It goes like this. The Quran is assumed to be true. Therefore, the Bible must be corrupt where it disagrees.
and the proof of that biblical corruption is simply the fact that it disagrees with the Quran. In a formal scholarly debate, this strips the corruption claim of any empirical evidentiary weight. You can't just assert history was changed without showing the original draft.
Now, item 3 focuses on the concept of al-Injil. The Quran asserts that Allah gave Jesus a singular, specific document or oral text called al-Injil, which essentially mirrors how the Quran itself was supposedly dictated to Muhammad. Scholars point out that the Quran is committing a fundamental category error right here. It's projecting its own dictation-based revelation model onto Christian historiography. Historically, the Christian Gospel isn't a single book handed down from heaven. It consists of 4 distinct biographical accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by multiple human authors over decades. When auditing the papyrological, archaeological, and historiographical data from the 1st through the 7th centuries, historians find absolutely zero evidence of any singular dictated document matching the Quran's description of al-Injil. It is, historically speaking, a phantom document. It simply never existed.
Let's transition into Phase 2, historical and physical evidence.
Item 2 is the Uthmanic standardization crisis. According to primary Islamic tradition, and we are quoting directly from Sahih al-Bukhari here, Uthman sent to every Muslim province 1 copy of what they had copied and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Caliph Uthman recognized significant widespread variations in the recited and written text of the empire. So, to unify the Islamic State politically and religiously, he standardized a single consonantal text and literally ordered all competing regional codices to be incinerated. Forensically, critics argue this is a devastating admission. Uthman was an administrative leader, an emperor essentially, not a prophet. He did not possess prophetic infallibility to perfectly distinguish between original divine revelation and scribal error. By burning the variant codices, this state-sponsored incineration destroyed the primary forensic evidence required to objectively verify textual integrity. Because we simply do not have those burned variants to compare against the standard, the modern argument for perfect, unbroken preservation relies heavily on an argument from silence. They burned the evidence that proved the text was fluid.
We do, however, have one incredibly important surviving piece of empirical evidence, which is item 6, the Sanaa palimpsest. A palimpsest is a parchment where the original text was washed or scraped off so the highly expensive material could be written on again. The erased lower text is known as the scriptio inferior, and it represents the older original layer. Radiocarbon dating places the parchment of the Sanaa palimpsest firmly between 614 and 656 CE, right at the origins of Islam. According to researchers like Sadeghi and Godarzi, modern ultraviolet imaging allows us to actually read that erased lower text today. And what it reveals is stunning. It provides empirical, physical proof of textual fluidity. The lower text contains major consonantal variants, differing word choices, and completely alternate verse sequences compared to the standard Uthmanic upper text. This hard physical evidence empirically falsifies the dogma of an unalterable, perfectly preserved verbatim text. It demonstrates, without a doubt, active scribal erasure and scriptural editing happening in real time.
Moving on to Phase 3, source syncretism and errors.
Item 7 covers source-critical dependency. If a text claims to be a direct, verbatim revelation from an omniscient creator, we would naturally not expect it to rely on localized human-authored mythology. Yet the Quran contains distinct narratives of an infant Jesus speaking from the cradle and creating living birds out of clay. When we trace these exact stories forensically, we find their direct origins not in reliable historical records from the 1st century, but in 2nd and 3rd century sectarian folklore. We're talking about texts like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Syriac Infancy Gospel, essentially late antique religious fanfiction. According to source-critical analysis, the author of the Quran incorporated pre-existing late antique Hijazi and Syriac legends, taking local campfire stories and presenting non-canonical, human-authored mythology as if it were omniscient historical fact.
Item 8 brings us to a really fascinating linguistic analysis. The Quran repeatedly asserts that it was dictated in pure, clear Arabic. However, textual scholars point to the widespread presence of anakalutha, which are syntactical or grammatical breaks in the text. These breaks often indicate the clumsy incorporation of foreign loanwords or layered editing over time. A deep lexical analysis by scholars, according to researchers like Christoph Luxemburg in his work The Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, and Arthur Jeffrey in The Foreign Vocabulary of the Quran, reveals a massive incorporation of foreign vocabulary. We are talking about foundational theological terminology in the text. Words like Quran, Furqan,
Injil, Surah, and Salat. These are not pure Arabic. They are actually borrowed directly from Syriac and Imperial Aramaic liturgical vocabularies. This grammatical and lexical data heavily contradicts the internal claim of an isolated, pure Arabic revelation, showing instead a text that is the product of rich Near Eastern linguistic syncretism.
The crucial point here is how this syncretism leads to severe historical errors, which is item 9. According to scholars like Stephen Adkins, the text exhibits massive chronological and historiographical anachronisms. It simply gets history wrong. First, the text places a figure named Haman as an architect serving the Egyptian pharaoh during the time of Moses. Historically, we know exactly who Haman was. He was a 5th century BCE Persian official from the court of Xerxes, living nearly 1,000 years later in an entirely different empire. Second, the text attributes the Exodus-era golden calf idolatry to a Samaritan. However, historical data proves the Samaritan ethnic and religious group did not even emerge until around 722 BCE, more than half a millennium after the Exodus. You can't have a Samaritan in the time of Moses. Third, the text explicitly identifies Mary, the 1st century mother of Jesus, as the sister of Aaron and daughter of Amram. This is a massive error that conflates her entirely with Miriam from the book of Exodus, separating the two women by over 1,400 years of history. And finally, archaeologists and historians point out a glaring geographic anomaly. Despite claims of its ancient prominence, there is absolutely no historical, cartographic, or archaeological mention of the city of Mecca anywhere in the historical record prior to the time of Muhammad. According to historical critics, an omniscient deity cannot commit foundational, chronological, and geographic errors like this, proving the text is a product of late antique human storytelling, mixing up dates, times, and characters.
Finally, we arrive at Phase 4, textual divergence and conclusion.
Item 10 deals with a concept known as qira'at. While popular apologetics often claim the Quran exists globally as a single, identical, word-for-word text with not a single dot changed, modern manuscript forensics and Islamic orthodoxy itself formally recognize 10 distinct canonical reading traditions, known as the qira'at. And let's be clear, these aren't just minor differences in pronunciation or regional accents, like saying tomato versus tomato. These traditions contain thousands of documented vocalic and consonantal discrepancies. And these discrepancies actively alter grammatical structures, legal rulings, and theological meanings. The narrative of absolute single uniformity simply doesn't match the historical and modern reality of these accepted, divergent canonical traditions.
To expand on this, we look to the forensic arguments of Dr. James White regarding this qira'at crisis. According to Dr. White, the physical existence of printed canonical Quranic editions that feature conflicting consonantal skeletons, meaning the actual foundational Arabic letters of the text differ from book to book, empirically refutes the dogma of verbatim preservation. For instance, semantic divergences exist across these accepted texts where one version translates to "they fought" and another translates to "they were killed." One says "he proclaimed," another says "say." One says "owner," another says "king." Dr. White argues that these discrepancies actively alter theological meanings, proving that human oral and written transmission produced demonstrable textual evolution, and that profoundly impacts the text's structural integrity.
So, let's synthesize the first 5 items of our forensic audit. We examined the scholarly view of the verification dilemma, where the text logically invalidates itself by appealing to 7th century scriptures that explicitly contradict its core claims. We looked at the Uthmanic preservation crisis, revealing how state-sponsored destruction of variant manuscripts relies entirely on an argument from silence. We covered the historical category error regarding the myth of the singular gospel. We detailed the logistical impossibility of a global, synchronized corruption of biblical manuscripts known as tahrif, comparing it to hacking thousands of offline computers without a trace. And we showed how the absence of an original baseline text leaves the corruption claim completely reliant on a circular burden of proof.
Completing our summary, we looked at the Sauna palimpsest, providing undeniable physical, radiocarbon-dated evidence of textual fluidity and scribal erasure. We exposed the text's dependency on late antique apocrypha, essentially borrowing 2nd century religious fanfiction. Lexical audits revealed a heavy reliance on foreign vocabulary, undermining the pure Arabic claim. We highlighted massive historical and chronological anachronisms, including the conflation of Mary and Miriam, the historical misplacement of Haman, and the glaring lack of pre-Islamic historical records for the city of Mecca. Finally, we examined the undeniable reality of semantic divergence across the canonical qira'at traditions.
Together, this archaeological, linguistic, and logical evidence conclusively outlines the profound structural vulnerabilities identified by historical critical scholars across the board.
We want to leave you with this final, deliberate question to consider today. If a text commands absolute, eternal authority over humanity, and its entire defense is based on the highly specific premise of flawless historical preservation and textual perfection, how does its foundation survive an objective forensic audit that uncovers fluid manuscripts, borrowed myths, and glaring historical anachronisms? The evidence is thoroughly on the table. The deeper exploration? Well, that is now up to you.